Good afternoon, everyone. There we go. So thank you so much for coming to the session on the resurgence of local news, something near and dear to my heart. I'm going to introduce Stephanie, our moderator for today's panel, and then I'll let her introduce the other guests. So Stephanie Smyth is the managing editor and co-anchor of Live at 5 and Live at 5:30 for CP24. Smyth joined CP24 in 2008, and she's worked in the news industry for more than 25 years. I'm sure many of you already know her. She began her career in London, Ontario. That's where I did. Yeah. That's where I started my career. And she's held many positions in the news industry in Toronto, including news director at 680 News, AM 640, and Global Toronto. So over to Stephanie, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I guess I'm a dinosaur in this business now. So listen, we are lucky enough today to talk about local news and does it matter. And if anybody woke up this morning to hearing what happened in Mississauga, I guess we all know how much it still matters very much. With me today for our panel, a fantastic crew here, all very, very versed in what local matters and how it matters and why it should continue to matter. So I'm going to introduce from the side, this is Dave Budge. Dave Budge is the Vice President of News and Information with Rogers Media, for television with Rogers Media. He's been in journalism and broadcasting for more than 40 years, working radio, TV, digital, print. And he started as a radio reporter, and he's been a producer. He's been in news management for a quarter of a century. That's sounds like way too long, but that means a lot of great experience, like me. And he worked at Global Vancouver and Calgary, CBC in Calgary, and Rogers in Toronto. And so we'll talk more with Dave about how City is expanding. And next to Dave is Cathrin Bradbury. She has been one of the top editors in newspapers in Canada, including the Globe and Mail, Rogers Publishing, Metro News, now as editor-in-chief for Star Metro National. And at Star Metro, she's building a new newsrooms to expand the Star footprint right across Canada. And then we have Fred Mattocks. He is the general manager of local services for CBC's English services. So he is responsible for all the programming focused on local and regional audiences and operations based in those locations, as well as for the relationships with the local communities. Next to Fred is Cindy Clyne, and she is the group news director for MBC, My Broadcasting Corporation. So she's head of news programming, and so she's responsible for overseeing news for MBC's 22 radio stations in Ontario. So thank you all for coming, participating. I don't think you're going to find many here on this panel, we were saying earlier, who are going to be against local news, but what they can speak to is how local news has changed and become less important, more important. Today is a chance to ask a ton of questions and find out more about the philosophy behind local news and how it matters. So we're going to start getting each of our panelists to explain briefly what has changed in local news for each of them and where they're expanding or where they're pushing the service and how this resurgence of local news is working for their service. So let's start with Dave Budge.
Okay, thanks. Well, we're in the unique position at City and Rogers that having been for quite some time only having City News in Toronto, over the last year and through the rest of this year, we're expanding into local daily newscasts in all 5 other city markets. So in a time when the industry appears to be shrinking, we're just growing and expanding and filling 50-plus jobs and starting up local newscasts in Vancouver, Calgary, and Montreal this year to complement the ones that are already on the air as of last year in Edmonton and Winnipeg. So it's a really exciting time and an unusual kind of opportunity to grow in a different way, which is great.
Right, lots of discussion about the platforms and how we get our news locally. Cathrin Bradbury, we spoke about your position in newspapers in Canada. Tell us about the ventures that you're working on right now.
Well, we're doing exactly the same thing that you are, which makes me realize that we are cutthroat competitors sitting here beside each other. But we have really just in the past few months, we've been working on it for the past few months, but we launched April 10th with a national expansion of the Star. So the Toronto Star took the metro local footprint in 5 cities across the country, and we made them Star Metro. everything now feeds into the star.com. We have this catchphrase that we use, which is nationalization through localization. So we're really pushing hard on really building up the local teams of reporters, which has been incredibly exciting to be hiring. I'm sure you found that too. And building up the teams and pushing them hard to get enterprise local journalism that we otherwise wouldn't be getting out of those cities.
And Fred, I said you're the general manager of local services for CBC's English services. So what changes are you seeing in your organization showing the push to how important this is or remains or continues to be?
Yeah, I mean, there's two aspects to it, the audience-facing aspect or the audience demand aspect of it, which is as Canadians' media habits change and become more and more local, and more and more digital, I should have said digital first, then local, we've shifted our focus and accent across our 45 local operations across the country to be more digital and to meet Canadians where they live in digital platforms. At the same time, we've also been conducting what people in this room will know is the really hard work of shifting our workflows and internal processes to actually meet that challenge so that we actually are able to deliver content to Canadians in the way they want.
Okay. And Cindy, you're talking the radio platform. How are things changing at your organization?
Well, local is the entirety of what we do. We're branded local news first, and we're kind of shifting the brand a little bit to be breaking in local news first. So, I mean, we've never taken our foot off the gas when it comes to local. It's always been the main focus. It's the way we sell ourselves, and it's always worked well in small and medium markets where there's no one talking to these listeners. If anything, we've just become more intense over time. I think what is changing is that 5 years ago, even 90% of our content was being generated by, boots on the ground reporting, press releases, tips from listeners. Now we're shifting more, I think, towards social in terms of that's where we're getting our ideas from. In a lot of these small towns that we're covering, each town has like a little community Facebook page where people go to talk about everything from grandma's yard sale to, gossip, like someone saw the mayor out with someone who wasn't his wife last night. So there's that bad stuff too. But we're getting a lot of leads there in terms of what people care about, and so we're forming our stories around what people are talking about, and I think that's the main thing that's changed.
Well, and talking about local news and watching, in our organizations, how it's hard to believe that it ever wasn't a key factor, but I guess it came down to dollars and monetizing how what we present and how that can make money for a company to justify it. Are companies making money from local news now, or is it the place to park the dollars? Dave?
Oh, you can still make money at local news. I really believe that. We're in the black at City in Toronto, and I think that's unusual. But there isn't the same money that was there in the 20th century. And so if you want to be sustainable, let alone profitable, you've got to control your costs. And that can't, I think the key is that can't be achieved just by cutting and doing things the same way. You've got to reinvent yourself. You've got to redefine the way you're going to create news, and you've got to do that based on a kind of a new set of values and priorities and rethink your whole model. But if you do that, then yeah, you can still make money. And the other thing is that there's money to be lost if you don't, right? The stronger your local news presence is, the better the connection you have with the community. That leads to loyalty, that leads to primetime ratings, that leads to sales opportunities, and it's not a game to get into.
When you talk about rethinking your model, what do you mean by that? And if any others can speak to this, how the local news that you've been doing throughout your career, how is it changing now in that model?
Well, a lot of what we've based our model for the local news production in the cities outside of Toronto is based on some of the presentation changes that we've made at City in Toronto over the last couple of years. And the simple version of that is You don't need a set, and you don't need an anchor. You need to tell stories. You need to tell relevant, different stories than your competitors, and you need to be out there in the community and put your emphasis on the journalism and not on the trappings and the artifice of 20th century television. And if you do that and invest in the right kind of things, that'll pay off for you with the audience.
Cathrin, how does that expand or work in the
Yeah,
area?
I think that it's absolutely true. You can't cut your way to profitability, but you need to cut everything that is superfluous to the journalism. Everything that's superfluous to the journalism. So we've invested a lot in journalists across the country. We've got robust newsrooms now right across the country, but we are cutting everything else we can. And in terms of reinvention, we're really moving toward a data universe. It doesn't mean that data is going to make decisions for us, but the kinds of journalists we've hired are excited about what data can do for their journalism, excited for the paths it can lead them on, excited about what it tells them about what people are interested in and what they're not interested in. Whereas I find some journalists of different generations, my own for instance, have a very adversarial relationship with data. It's like, no monkey is going to tell me what story to write. So that's our biggest mindset transformation is getting a lot of reader data, watching how readers react to the stories we do, and then thinking about that as journalists and thinking how we want to react to it and how we don't want to react to it. Doesn't mean we're not going to do Rob Ford stories, Doug Ford stories, but it might mean that we're not going to do a 10,000 analysis piece on some arcane...
So if the data tells you that you're losing the reader on that and it's not catching the clicks that you want, it's just like move on. I mean, that's a slippery slope, I guess, with this.
Well, if we'd had data when the Star was working on Rob Ford, we would have, and done what data told us, we would have stopped doing Rob Ford because readers were begging us to stop. Readers were really upset, like more readers than you would imagine were really upset about Rob Ford. Of course we wouldn't stop doing it, and we wouldn't stop doing a story like that now. But yeah, if data tells you that people are one of the things we find is that people are really interested in local stories about people, the little guy who gets wronged, who we help, or they help themselves, or the community helps them. That story gets a lot more traction than a 5,000-word analysis piece on City Hall. It's
really?
So yes, we will adjust in that way.
Right. Fred?
Absolutely the same thing. Journalism is the heart of it. Storytelling is the heart of it. Great stories, great characters, relevance to your audience, all of those things that we've all known forever, except they're more alive than they ever were. And the audience is actually part of the larger conversation, so you hear from them right away. And we too are thinking very much about data, but it's not data in the kind of big data model of 2 or 3 years ago where just more numbers and more data is better. It's really to recognize that data itself isn't the value point. It's insights based on data.
Exactly.
And it's funny because that brings you back to programmers and journalists. At the end of the day, they're the people who understand what the data is saying to us.
And what about with you, Cindy?
I guess if I could go to your original question about is local profitable or can you make money from it, I would say absolutely. Because it's currently undervalued, I find, with a lot of media. So, and hopefully we're returning to that. I'm hoping that this panel today means that we're kind of getting back there. But NBC has, we're a young company, like 12 years old, and on the Profit 500 list 7 years running. 90% of our revenue comes from small business, and they're buying us because we're hyper-local. So there's huge money to be made. I guess the obstacle is going to be, will the public ever pay for it? That remains to be seen. But I do think that listeners and readers are coming around to realize that news does have value.
By the way, open to any questions right now. If anybody in the audience wants to ask anything of any of our panelists, by all means, just put up your hand. Davis, speaking about the journalism, and so was Fred, and let's just talk for a minute about if you could think of one story that resonated with your audience unlike any other, and talk about why you think that happened, what was driving that popularity. I'd start with whomever wants.
Got an example?
Oh, I've got one.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of us can't remember what we did like 5 minutes ago, right? But, you know.
Well, we've had a couple. We're paying a lot of attention to what people respond to. I mentioned a human story. We had a cab driver in Halifax who late at night picked up a bunch of guys, and one of them started to catcall a woman, and he stopped the cab and said, "I want you to get out." Most of the men were very rude. They got out. One of the young guys in the front seat apologized. It turned out that the next person he had in his cab was a young reporter. He told the story to her, and she posted it. And it just went crazy. And it had those elements of, and it went right across the country. That was one of the things we're finding, is a good local story.
Right.
And you might recall that Halifax has had a terrible trouble with taxi drivers assaulting women. So this was a good news story. So it ended up on the front page of the Star in Toronto, and it got a lot of traction right across the country. So that was a fun, small, super local story with one enterprising kid who had a bit of luck getting into the cab at the right time. So that would be an example I'd have.
I like what Cathrin was saying about local stories traveling, because they a great story always travels. And people find, interest in it. Yesterday's snowfall in central Newfoundland traveled right across the country, and many things do. This morning, as I was looking at some of our engagement stuff, one of the most engaged stories we have actually came out of Newfoundland as well, out of Corner Brook, and it was a very warm and touching human story about a woman who's 108 years old, was the oldest woman in Newfoundland, who just passed on. And it was a celebratory story of her life and her connections with her community. And it was right up there in terms of our engagement with all the other stories. So it's the classic news stuff, as well as being able to connect people with communities and connect people with characters.
And you've got to be able to sprinkle it all in with the day's news, right? Yeah. So somehow, you're going to have to do that City Hall story, whatever, that's local, but the one that's going to catch all the attention could be, we found a den of foxes in a backyard in North Toronto, and everybody, something was like, what's, who knew foxes would live in Toronto? Yeah. But, and it's visually driven too sometimes.
Yeah, I pulled up the numbers of our the stories that got the most traffic over the last couple of months, and about 2/3 of our stories that really resonated the most were the enterprise stories. That they weren't the van attack, and they weren't the natural disasters. They were the kids who created a butter dispenser to put on toast. Weird little things, and some of it's good enterprise, original, investigative sort of journalism with local con men and stories where you go to bat for the little guy, but it's such a mix, and it's not. It's really encouraging to see that it's not just the big agenda and the big breaking news stories that drive audience. People respond to original stories that they're not getting anywhere else.
Although the big agenda stories, it's interesting. So the Star worked for almost 2 years on a bad doctor investigation, doctors who are just shuffled across borders from Canada to the States and across provincial borders, and we uncovered doctors all across Canada. And what we decided, now that we've become national, is to localize that story in every province. So originally it was worked on as a Toronto story, and then we went and found doctors in Vancouver and Edmonton and Calgary and Halifax, and it really gave us, to localize those stories, it really gave us huge traction right across the country, because people reacted to it in their own backyard. And in fact, in Alberta and Vancouver, we've got the premiers in both provinces saying, we're going to make change. So it can also be the great big investigative piece if you bring it down to a grassroots city level.
I see a question in the audience. Ron Waxman, Global News.
Question in the audience, specifically for Cindy. I'm just wondering what your sales structure is in these local markets, how many sales representatives you have, and where does digital sales figure into the strategy? Do you have direct digital sales? Do you rely on programmatic? That sort of a thing.
I can't give you sort of all of the figures, but I can give you a general idea that most of our markets have at least 3 salespeople and generally 2 reporters. And that can be for a town, as small as 10,000, 8,000 people. So sales, there's a huge focus on sales. Digital, it's still growing for us. It's still not where our meat and potatoes is. I don't even know what the percentage would be, but I mean, it's probably only 15% at best of what we're selling is digital. And that's just kind of a wild guess on my part based on sort of conversations I've heard, because I'm on the news side of things. But yeah, does that answer the question? Yeah.
Richard Bloom, City News.
Not for my boss, for Cathrin. The concept of nationalization of local news, what are some of the hurdles, some of the obstacles that you found in the first few months that you guys have been doing the Star Metro?
Hiring was surprisingly hard. I don't know if other people have found that, but I thought that would be the easiest thing in the world. We hear about out-of-work journalists everywhere, and I couldn't hire people for love or money. It was really challenging. And
Is it journalists, like just pure for the
this was just for journalists. I had people. I offered jobs. Sometimes competitors, CBC, City would come in and counter offer. So it's gotten way more competitive out there in terms of journalism. I think we should be kind of proud of ourselves that we're actually pretty robust now in our ability to hire journalists. So that was a surprise. And you mentioned the kind of getting an infrastructure set up. Like this was a merger of a 10-year or 12-year-old plucky little local paper organization with the great big footprint of the Toronto Star. And so there was a lot of just really workflow stuff. Like we had so many conversations with maps of workflows. I thought I was going to kill myself if I had to look at one more, the complicated arrows. But it was really rethinking, how stories came in and what time they filed, and all of the time zones across the country. You're used to dealing with one, and now you're dealing with however many there are. So things like that, infrastructure stuff, and then getting the right talent.
I saw some other hands up there. Any other questions? Let's start. Yes.
In the last session, Kevin Newman mentioned the stat that 55% of a younger demographic has less interest in local. I would immediately connect that to the way the world is changing in size. We are starting to think globally thanks to what we hold in our hand. So how do you find that balance between global thinking but a local mandate?
I've been around digital for a long time. I've been around in this business for a long time. And I've heard the digital means global many, many, many times. And it's true in the respects that the gentleman who was here from Knight talked about. But digital is also intensely local, because life is local. And the thing that digital has done, and particularly mobility handsets have done, is they've brought your life and that device together in a way that is so powerful. And I think that's the unique thing here. I think, that's the thing that has changed the opportunity for local. I think this might be a very different conversation if it wasn't for digital devices.
So local news would not have stayed alive the way it has.
I didn't say that, but I think it would be a less optimistic conversation.
Right.
I think Roshni may have been trying to goad me into action here. I think that, to be maybe provocative, a big part of the reason that so many younger audience members are consuming less local news is because they're rejecting the delivery of it. They are rejecting a boring presentation of irrelevant stories in a format that isn't convenient to them and doesn't meet their needs and expectations. So Kevin suggested, if I understood him in the last session, that you can see a day when people stop consuming local news. I think there's 0% chance of that happening. I don't think that will
Kevin
ever
in the
happen.
room?
One of the things that I really insisted on was young and diverse. I just was absolutely adamant that the people we hired, which is average age 28 now across the country, reflected the stories that we wanted to get out of our communities. And it's made for really, really exciting newsrooms. And I say to them, write the stories that excite you. What do you talk about with your friends? What do you think about in the shower? Like, what is happening in your own life, in your own town? That's the story I want you to pitch to me.
And that's, I don't know if there's another question. Yes. Hello. Jim.
Hi, Steph. Cathrin just started to pick up on the question I was going to ask into your earlier comment about hiring. If I could get from each of you one or two of the either the hardest skills, the number one most attractive skills for young journalists to have when they send you resumes. Spelling we'll take as kind of a given, but it is not a given, I can guarantee you that. But just a few tips for those of us who work with young journalists who may be looking to get hired by you.
I'll say for the expansion that we've been doing into the other markets, where we've had the unique kind of luxury of being able to hire almost entirely new staff and build newsrooms from scratch without legacy attitudes and existing workflows. The single most important attribute for all the people that we hired was positive energy, right? It was people that got it, who just want to bring it and want to work hard. It was attitude above anything else. And we're looking for a complex mix of skills, because our videographers they're the reporters that are driving themselves to the story that they're shooting, and they are editing it, and they are presenting it on television. That's a lot of different skills to bring. But if they don't have the attitude and the energy and just the drive to do that on a daily basis, and they don't love journalism, then forget it. So I'd say that's my number one.
And it's gone beyond the one, you're filing your item and you're done, right? It's like there's so many more elements to CBC. You're doing the digital, you're doing radio, you're doing television. Yeah. It's fulsome. And those expectations, are the people who are applying to you, are they showing that understanding on their resumes?
Absolutely. And, in some ways, the easy ones are the, what we call the digital natives, the people who are very close to their graduation from school and who just get it. They just get it. And they may not know how to use a professional camera. They may not know how to do a professional radio interview, but that we can teach them. The rest, they get. And they're the easy ones. And it's not always the youngest ones either. It's, I think what I'd add to the wish list is curiosity. I think in today's world, curiosity is something that you can't have enough of.
Jim Van Horn is here from Fanshawe. I bet your program has adapted over the years to reflect what is being delivered in the news platform, right?
But it's interesting. I don't know if anybody cares, but positive energy, attitude, above all else, these are things that we're almost, I think our educator friends can shake their heads. We're encouraged to kind of build that out of any evaluation, but on a, we can't, because it's quite subjective. It could be considered quite subjective to say your attitude isn't quite good enough. You need to have a more positive attitude. That is a very subjective thing that's very difficult to measure in an assignment, for example. However, we hear this over and over when we come to conferences like this. So I just wanted to, yes, we are adapting certainly to the digital need that you have, and that's, I think, fantastic. And but curiosity and positive energy is a difficult one in an academic environment. I think most people would agree.
If I could add, what we're looking for, definitely, like Dave said, ambition is everything. If they don't want to be there,
right.
24/7 doing their job and doing it great, I'm less likely to hire them unless I know that they're really, truly committed. But the other thing that I think is really important to local that we're missing is commitment to the community. And it's part of what we do because we serve smaller markets. They are more close-knit. We look for people that live in the community. Ideally, if we can take a broadcast grad that was from that town and put them there, that is our ideal candidate because they understand the community, they're going to care, they're going to know what people care about there. Andrew Buttigieg, who's sitting over there in the black shirt, he's a perfect example. Andrew is from St. Thomas and is now the news director in St. Thomas and also our West Region news director. But he embodies what we look for. Andrew sits on how many boards in town? Volunteers for everything, and it's that community engagement. That's where you're going to get the best local news because they're so connected. So connection is really important too.
So let's talk about the skill set. So Dave's been doing a lot of hiring across the country. When you're doing that, you talk to the videographer. What is the digital role for your new hires, if there is such a...
Honestly and frankly, right now, digital is not the first priority for the new hires in those regions because so much of the impetus for this was the regulatory change and the CRTC's commitment, and that's all focused on getting the broadcast on the air on television. However, as Fred points out, the younger journalism grads, they get it, right? And the people that we've been hiring are the most frustrated that we're not emphasizing digital to the extent that they'd like us to, right? So the expectation on their part is that that's table stakes. We need to be digital first.
It always seems like in the newsroom, you have the cluster of the people, the journalists working the traditional, and then they're maybe a decade or two younger in the digital pool, right? They're showing us various things that we can start to incorporate. But when you look at social media and the impact it's had on how we cover stories locally or anywhere, right, around the planet, local, as you're saying, international becomes local in a heartbeat when you're dealing with something that happens in Berlin or London or wherever. But that social media interaction and the ability to take things from social media in our community and use them on our platforms is amazing. How did we do it without social media before, right?
And that's why with our new teams, they're leading the way on this. They understand social. They're finding the stories there. They're using social to promote their stories. Even when we don't have kind of a robust investment in the digital side, they're making it happen for us.
It's sort of innate to them.
Yeah.
And how are you capitalizing on that?
Well, just an example came to mind. You might remember the story of the video that broke of the woman in Denny's in Edmonton who was racially insulting a new Syrian and Canadian. And it was not a new video, but it resurfaced as those videos do. And the reporters in Edmonton just jumped on it, and this story just took off. I mean, that was a great case of using social media, but you can't just use social media and report on it. You have to take it a lot further. So they found the person in the video, and they talked to him. They talked to the place where the woman worked. She subsequently lost her job, and they just kept pushing and pushing and pushing on this story. So I don't so much think, and I don't think anybody thinks, you just sort of use social media as a grab bag, but it sure is a great resource.
It's an amazing resource when you see what you can, from video to pictures, and then now people so actively, who aren't in our industry at all, but they work social media like a job.
Yeah.
And we can, leverage that to our benefit, you find.
Well, it's a shift from, maybe not a shift from, but an addition to the sort of classic broadcast delivery metaphor, where you're moving from something being delivered in your interest to a conversation with you about your life and what's going on and what you care about. And that shift, is central, I think, in all of the other things that this conference is about. As the more people have a relationship with your company, with your brand, with your values, the more they're going to value you in a world that's chaotic and hard to understand.
How do you think the audience is adapting to local news? Like, how do you think, are their expectations changing? And are we answering those expectations?
Oh, I think the expectations on us right now are higher than they've ever been. As journalists, we're called to task for everything now, and it's done publicly. So, I mean, I think we have to be better than we ever have. If you've done a story, you better be able to back it up. You better have fact checked it. You better have gotten both sides. So I don't quite understand, I guess, the loss of trust in the media, because if anything, we're more accountable. So
Right.
At some point, I think things have to come together.
And they want it on the immediate too. That's the other
Yeah.
thing. Like yesterday,
Yes.
and they know when it's
Instant.
old. And you
Yeah.
never assume that your viewer knows less than you do. Really, never. I mean, there was a day when we had our sources book and we were working, and we knew all the angles. But it's now everybody is tuned in completely.
Yeah, I think you said earlier, it's become much more participatory.
Yeah.
It's not a talking at people or talking down to people. It's a conversation with your readers much more than it used to be.
We have a question from Francis from City News. Hello.
Hi, Steph. We share a challenge, Cathrin, about finding good young journalists, right? It really is challenging, and I'm sure I would love to hear some perspective from the others on the panel as well. I'm a hiring manager. Some of my postings get 200 applicants, and then by the time you weed out the people who don't have any journalism experience or education and are working in retail or at the grocery store,
It's true.
right?
Yeah.
You're down to maybe 20, 15 even, and then you shortlist and you're down to 3 or 4, and it's incredibly difficult. And I'm wondering, the old way used to be you would look to your outer markets, or you would go to the schools. But even I find now, I spoke at the Ontario Association of Broadcasters a couple months ago. Even broadcast journalism students don't know anything about our broadcast product or even our news brand. And I'm just wondering, where do we need to tap into a source? What is the source now to find some good local journalists that care about actually doing journalism, who care about the story and want to pursue stories?
Well, I wouldn't recommend this necessarily, but one thing we have done, and it's been successful in a couple markets, is a little local talent search. And this allowed everybody, not just journalists, to apply. And we have found a few people that were keepers. They're great. They're plugged into their community. We were able to teach them how to write and teach them how to voice. And there's a girl who works for me in Renfrew. Her name is Chris Kite, and she's a great example of that. No journalism experience whatsoever, but knew everyone in town, and was really outgoing. And she's a great news anchor now and a great reporter. So that, yeah, no, you can't have her. But so sometimes, maybe you have to look outside of the journalism schools and look outside of the industry if you're willing to put in the time to train them. It's hard, though.
Yeah. And I think super young. One of the people we hired was in the radio room at the Star, and she wasn't on our interview list. She just came and knocked on my door and said, I want to work for you, and I'll go to any city in Canada. And I basically said, you're hired. Because so many of the people I talked to wouldn't move. That was the other thing that really surprised me. I would beg them, I'll give you this great job in Vancouver, Edmonton, or Alberta, and they did not want to leave Toronto. So when she said, and she hadn't even graduated from school, she had to come back. Her first day on the job, Humboldt happened, and she was our lead reporter on it, and she wrote an amazing story that showed a day in the life of how their day started ordering Eggs Benedict at the local restaurant, and it broke all records for us until the van attack. So it was I wouldn't even call it a gamble. It was just, speaking of values, she walked in, she had the news values, the aggression, the passion to work, to do whatever we threw at her,
But
and she didn't have any experience.
No education in journalism?
She was in a journalism program, I think at Humbert, and she had to come back to graduate after she wrote the Humboldt story.
Wow.
Yeah, she's 23. And you can't have her either.
Did you want to say anything? But we've got a question in the audience. Which
Well, just our perspective on this is slightly different, but I think that one thing for the whole industry is I don't think we're close enough to the J schools and the educational institutions that are our supply chain. We're nowhere near close enough. And I think that's our fault. I don't think that's the educational institution's fault. I think we need to do, as an industry, more to reach out and to be helping and influencing who's in our supply chain.
Okay, we have a question.
I have an answer. My question. I teach journalism at Carleton. I teach an advanced video journalism class. And I would suggest that maybe what you want to do is think about more meaningful work opportunities for students in third year, in first year masters, to bring them in and not sit them in a corner. My background was I was the CTV news director in Ottawa for 16 years, and we brought them in. We put their desk in the middle, surrounded them with the senior reporters so that they could be mentored by those senior reporters. We brought them in for a week from the journalism schools, and then we took the top ones. We asked the camera operators, we asked the assignment editors who was the best, and we would take 2 or 3 for the summer. So we had summer employment, summer fill-in with people who had already been trained because we brought them right in. But it was a whole culture of learning that you have to foster within your newsroom. And what ended up happening was that all of the other CTV news directors would call me and say, do you have any good ones? And it became a feeder system for the entire CTV. And then I'm not sure, I'm not in the newsroom anymore, so I'm not sure what happened. But it's a culture that you have to work at, and it's a culture that to foster that mentoring, and you really have to, you really have to work at it. And you take that model and you put it in all the different places in Canada where there are good journalism schools and colleges, and it really works, and it becomes a whole farm system.
Well, you can send us all that blueprint. Sounds good. But it is true, because with the students, when they come on their internship for a week or whatever, it's an investment. It's a huge investment of time, resources, energy, when you're just trying to get the news going, right? You're just trying to get your product on the air. But
if you do it that way, it's a drain. But
that's
if you
right.
think of it as an investment that pays off that summer, when everyone's away and you're stuck with the 3 reporters doing 2.5 hours or 3 hours of news a day, then it pays off.
Yeah, I agree, and I think you're right. Though it is a you have to create that culture where that opportunity for them to actually work and contribute and strut their stuff is there. Because if they sit in the corner, they waste their time and hours.
Any more questions?
The question, yeah. The question was, how do you keep talking about social media, and they get it, and the social, the technology and all of that. And what I'm finding in my classroom is they know that stuff, but the news culture is not there. There's no junkies. There's nobody who, they talk about municipal politics or anything like that. They have no idea, and they're not following. They may be following a particular topic if they like sports, or they may be following something, but they're not getting that balance that I guess as news directors we have, where here are your top 10 stories. And so when we do news exercises and lives and practice all of that stuff, the news knowledge just isn't there. They're just don't seem to think it's part of the job.
It's all at their fingertips, too. Just a click away. Any other questions? Okay, one more. Last one. Sorry.
I know you guys were talking about this earlier. I kind of know our perspective, because when I started at MyFM about 7 years ago, we were all about being at every city council meeting we ever, no matter what, it was mandatory. We just had a meeting with our president, I think a conference call, and it's almost like we're starting to shift away from that and not wasting our resources on a reporter sitting in a room for what could be up to 3 or 4 hours at a time, and maybe just doing a follow-up on that sort of stuff. So I'm kind of interested in getting your takes on, I know you guys were kind of touching on it at the start, municipal coverage, court coverage, sending a reporter to sit in a room for that long. Does it matter? Is it the story that you look at, and whether you pull a resource to go sit there for that long? Or I'm interested in.
Well, I think one of the issues is, depending on your market and your competition and your resources, is Are you going to go to that city council meeting with the one reporter that you've got when every other outlet in town is also at that city council meeting? Because if you're going to cover the same stories that everybody else is covering, what value are you offering to the community? So if you've got, if you're in Toronto and there's half a dozen, competitive TV newsrooms and twice as many competitive radio newsrooms, and the vast majority of them are covering the same stories, you've got to, with your limited resource, you've got to make some choices sometimes and say, we're not going to go to the school board meeting because we know that everybody else is covering that school board meeting.
Or there's no interesting story at that school board meeting.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I actually have on my wall written in huge letters, like, no matches, no pressers. We just can't do what everyone else is doing. And we don't have the staff for one thing, but I just don't think there's a reader interest. We have all kinds of ways to get that kind of straight up news. So we have to think way more originally. It doesn't mean we don't have beats. It doesn't mean we don't have courts and justice and crime, although now we have beats like race and equity, and the beats have changed a lot as well. But no, we're not in the business of sending people for hours to the same thing that everybody else is doing anymore.
And that's a positive kind of change, I would say, on the approach to beats, because there's a real tendency at City Hall and at Queen's Park for the reporters to get fixated on the process. And the reporters all run along in a pack covering the same stories at the same time and delivering the same content. And what's the value to the community, right? If you get sucked into the kind of the habit and the routine at this institution, you're not finding the great stories. You're not really focusing on people, and you're not distinguishing yourself from the competition and providing something different. So
I would say that's true in a large market where you have 3 or 4 different media outlets at something. I think in a small market, we do need to be there to a certain extent. I still believe this because our small town papers are disappearing. So we are the only people bringing them any kind of municipal news.
If you're the only ones keeping the politicians accountable, then good for you. So
Yeah.
for sure.
So I think you just have to, you do have to measure whether it's a good use of resources.
Okay, and with that, we have to wrap up. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. And thank you to Cindy, to Fred, and Cathrin, and Dave. We really appreciate your time today.
And thank you to Stephanie as well. Thank you so much. Just so everybody knows what's happening, so if you are interested in managing opinion, that will be in this room. If you're interested in the platform debate, it's next door. And both of them are going to be live streamed as well. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.